The village in it with a map and a plan. No place too tiny for this determined man. Crossing the counties one by one, he'll see in every English corner a bit of history.
Hello folks, welcome back to Pendle for the fourth and final time in this little run of booths. Now this last booth has the longest name of the four that we've been talking about so far. This one has a lot to do with the Pendle Witches, and at the end of this episode I'll be basically talking you through what happened in 1612 out here. This is Higham with West Close Booth. Higham with West Close Booth, high village with a western enclosure shelter. Concluding this first little run of parishes in Pendle, the last booth on our list for now is the one which has the strongest link so far to the Pendle Witches. The main village in this one is called Higham, and it belongs to the parish of Higham with West Close Booth. The centre of Higham is a conservation area, and most of its buildings in and around it are made of stone, built mainly in the 19th century. A few are a little older. Several farmhouses and barns have been converted to houses. Outside the conservation area, most buildings are from later periods, including modern housing estates. Clovercroft Mill once stood in the centre of this village, having latterly been used as a furniture factory. Its demolition was completed in 2006 to enable a housing development to be built on its site. Amenities here include a pub named the Four Alls Inn, the Church of St John the Evangelist, Higham C of E Primary School, and a village hall. Among the more unusual features here is the Spout, which provides a constant supply of natural spring water. Higham Hall, a 17th century building, was once used as the meeting place for the court that ruled over the Forest of Pendle. One of the families swept up in the Pendle witch trials in 1612 was the Chattocks clan. They were based in West Close, where the old crone Mother Chattocks lived, and her family pursued their work of professional begging. We'll learn about them in this episode, and it'll tie together nicely all we know so far about the witches. Broomsticks at the ready, let's fly one last time for now around Pendle. We begin this wander around Higham with a huge residential area that covers the western half of the village. Whilst most of this might have been built several decades ago, there's one bit that's brand new, and that's what we're heading for first. It's a fair trek away, so while we walk, let's fill in a bit of village history. Higham is situated to the south of Pendle Hill, and over the years it's changed from being reliant on agriculture to being one that's instead reliant on industrialisation. That only ended in the past few decades, and so now its purpose has changed again, this time to being, by and large, a commuter village. In Roman times, Higham occupied a position midway between the Roman camp at Ribchester and a colony at Colne. An old Roman road, which is now a country lane, runs along the top of the village, and it was known as the Highway of the Legions. The Saxons followed the Romans and left some evidence of their passage. The village name is the most obvious. Higham comes from two Saxon words, heg, which means high, and ham, which means small place or village. During Norman times, most of the land was part of Pendle Forest. It was uncultivated and available for hunting. Originally called Pendle Chase, it came to the possession of the de Lacy family. After their estates had passed by marriage in 1311 to Thomas, the Earl of Lancaster, Pendle Chase became subject to the laws of the Forest of Lancaster. Higham has, for many centuries, been associated with horses. There are place names connected with horses all around it, for example, Hunterholme and Dame Fold. In the 14th century, there was thought to be a horse breeding establishment here, owned by the king's representative, which bred horses for the Black Prince. Clovercroft Mill once stood here where these new builds are today. It was built in 1852 to spin cotton using power looms, weaving faster and cheaper than any handloom weaver ever could. By the time of the 1861 census, the power loom had well and truly taken over, as it recorded 126 residents of Higham as being power loom weavers. Clovercroft Mill wasn't small. It had 400 looms, and by the late 1870s it had a workforce of 150. It was extended in 1906 to have around 600 looms. It would still be here today, probably, if cheaper foreign imports hadn't forced its closure in 1962. The business was then taken over and became part of Viella. In 1969, Cloverbrook Limited was formed, which manufactured single and double jersey fabrics from 1970 until the mid-1990s. In 1995, it was sold to Winchester Furniture, who used it until 2004, but 2 years later, Clovercroft stood no longer. It was completely demolished in 2006, and now only the name of this new development, Clovercroft, is a reminder of Higham industrial past. It's important to note too, Higham also had a shuttle works, which then became a bobbin making factory. It was a water-powered site established in the first half of the 19th century. Today it's a dwelling called Clough Mill. Around the back of the former mill site these days is a huge playground and recreation area called Higham Park. This used to be quite an important area of the village back when farming was king. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, villagers in Higham used to collect water from a spring known as the Frog Well. It was located on Spring Meadow, which today is this very playing field. The spring, which later became known as Well Head, still exists in one corner of this field. When the mills and workers' cottages were built in the 1850s, mill owners gave the village its very own piped water supply. They did so by piping water directly from the Frog Well to the middle of the village and constructing something called the Spout. We'll see that in a few moments. As a playing field, football is played here nowadays. As far as I'm aware, Higham has never had an actual football team, but several notable footballers have called this place home. They include Harry Hargreaves. Born in Higham in 1896, Hargreaves played football and served in the East Lancashire Regiment during World War I. He was wounded in action and held as a prisoner of war for 18 months. He had the nickname Pay when he was young. Herbert Butterworth was another. He too was born in Higham in 1902 and went on to be a professional footballer. Neither of those men, though, could lay claim to being the most famous person to come from Higham. That honour instead is held by Sir Jonas Moore. Here's a bit about him. Sir Jonas Moore was born at Higher Whiteley on the 8th of February 1617. He became a leading practical mathematician, surveyor, cartographer, ordnance officer, courtier and patron of astronomy. He rose from his humble origins to be awarded a knighthood and gained membership of the Royal Society, winning favour at the court of Charles II. As a mathematician, he's best known as the first to use the notation cot or cotangent. He participated as a surveyor in two of the most ambitious projects of his time. He was involved with the building of a massive harbour wall named the Mole at Tangier in Morocco, but he also had a hand in a domestic project too. He was part of the great team who drained the fens, more specifically the Bedford Level, which commenced in 1649. He wrote an account of this work, which was printed in 1685 after his death. Oliver Cromwell procured from him a model of a citadel to bridle the City of London, and Samuel Pepys was said to possess a copy of his survey of the entire course of the River Thames. Perhaps his most important contribution was his setting up of the Royal Observatory at Greenwich with John Flamsteed, the first Astronomer Royal. Moore furnished Flamsteed at his own private expense with a 7-foot sextant as well as 2 clocks which were used in his work involved in finding longitude. In fact, as historically important as Flamsteed was, it has been said Moore's contribution to the founding of the Royal Observatory was far greater. Indeed, he was the sole driving force behind the scheme, according to some sources. Sir Jonas Moore died in 1679 whilst on a journey from Portsmouth to London. I've got to tell you folks, the wind is at its worst. It's been all day now I'm in Higham. It's going to be difficult to find places to shelter out of it to talk to the camera, so I might not talk to it very much here. We'll see. Let's move on. Let's head into the village centre. We're heading towards the pub, but there's a few bits and bobs before we get to that. In the 17th century, farming was the chief occupation here, but there were other domestic industries and crafts. Even at that time, the textile industry played a part in Higham economic life. There were millers, masons, blacksmiths, butchers, shoemakers, clothiers and weavers, many of whom also had small farms or farm holdings. Spinning wheels and looms were present in 3/4 of the households. Wool and flax were carded, combed and spun in most of them. Next, we have a pinfold. We haven't seen one of these in a while. This is a surefire way to know that an area was once reliant on agriculture. Here in this part of Lancashire, pinfolds were sometimes called pound fields. Indeed, this one has that very title. It still did the same job. Stray animals were kept in it until they were released upon payment of a fine. Highams was enclosed by a high wall and had fresh grass with a water supply running right through it at one time. 60 years ago, Higham supported many small businesses. There were 3 clubs, one each for Labour, the Liberals and the Conservatives. In terms of pubs, Higham has had one of those since 1792, and it's still going strong. This is the Four Alls Inn. Its name is derived from a saying known as the Four Alls. These are: the king rules all, a priest prays for all, a soldier fights for all, and the common man pays for all. Those 4 men are shown on its pub sign. As well as being a popular pub for centuries, the Four Alls was also once the headquarters of the Balloon Juice Company, which was a club of locals who met to drink and talk. The group was run as an actual company and even had an annual general meeting and a board of directors. Higham has had other businesses in its time, including a newsagent's, a general village store, a co-op, a post office, a cobbler's, a cafe, a sweet shop, 3 butchers, a blacksmith's, a joinery, an undertaker's, and even a baby clinic. However, by 2006, only the Four Alls Inn and the village shop and post office remained. 2 years later, the Four Alls was on its own. It still is today. In front of the Four Alls is the Spout, which we talked about earlier. Very quickly after this was built, it became a classic feature of the village, and even today it remains one of the best attractions to Highams' name. Because it's supplied with water from a natural spring, the Spout became well known for its purity and freshness, even in modern times. Even after the addition of mains water to the village, many locals still preferred it to tap water and continued to collect it by hand. However, these days that's not possible. The Spout eventually fell out of favour, and the water, being untreated, cannot be guaranteed for quality anymore. So don't drink it if you're ever here. Religiously, Methodism was very strong in Higham. Services were held in private houses until pressure of numbers resulted in the building of a chapel in 1812, which was extended and rebuilt over the years. 60 years later, Higham gained an impressive Wesleyan chapel which stood just off the main street. It was built in 1872 and demolished in 1983. The building may be gone now, but its former churchyard still remains. Down the side of this churchyard is Chapel Street. As early as 1816, there was a Methodist school on that road, which was replaced by a series of newer schools. There was one on Sabden Road in 1859. That closed in 1967, and today the site of it is now 4 dwellings. Okay, let's get the parish notice board out of the way. Another pin board. I like it. And there you go. That is Higham with West Close Booth done. I'll just shut the door. There we go. Okay, so we have a perch here in this bush shelter just for a moment before we continue the walk. We're now heading out towards the east, effectively. We're going to be passing Higham Hall next and the village hall before we reach the church, and then we're going to make our way back to the west again via the bypass, the A6068. Next on our walk is Higham Hall, perhaps one of the most notable buildings in the village. This originated as the manor house and it was first built in 1327. The modern version is a lot later, built as it was in the 17th century. Higham Hall is where the manorial or Halmote Court was held twice a year, in both April and October. Higham Hall was found to be unsuitable for the court around the middle of the 19th century, so instead it was transferred to the Four Alls Inn. The Halmote Court, though shorn of its old powers, continued to be held in Higham until the early 20th century. Higham other notable hall is this, the Village Hall, located just a few steps away up the street. To understand this building, you also have to have an understanding of how the church operated in Higham several years ago. The Village Hall is an old national school which was built by public subscription in 1837. It was also used for Church of England services at the time because Higham had no church until the 1870s. By 1872, more room was needed, so it was decided to build an actual church building on land adjoining the school. We'll see that shortly. As Higham grew thanks to the mills and their power looms, soon the school became vastly oversubscribed. Eventually, a new school was built further up the road, but the original national school continued to be used as an infant classroom and dining room. That setup continued until the late 1970s, when it was transformed into the present Village Hall. So here's the church. It stands on a 1-acre plot of land next to the old school. The vendor and guarantor of the land needed for the church was Legendre Starkey of Huntroyd. The foundation stone was laid on the 20th of July 1872. The formal application for a church dedicated to St John the Evangelist was made to the Ecclesiastical Commissioners in 1874, and the church was completed in 1876. This was originally a daughter church of St Leonard's in Padiham, and that remained the case until 2002, when it became a parish church in its own right. The church is now in a joint benefice with neighbouring St Anne's in Fence, further along the A6068. Okay, so we've seen the old school. Now what about the current school here in Higham? Well, that is there, right next to the church. Higham School never forgot its roots in the old National School building. The new building on the opposite side of the church is still referred to as Higham St John's Church of England Primary. The school attracts pupils not only from the village itself, but also from the surrounding areas. It offers both excellent academic teaching and also good pastoral care. What with Higham continued growth, the school has thrived over the years and remains one of the premier educational establishments in the area. Okay, we've made it to the bypass and the sun at the moment is just touching those hills you can see in the distance. And from here, it looks absolutely beautiful. I don't know whether you guys can see it though, because it is a long way over there in the distance, and my camera's not great at picking up things from, you know, this far away. What I'll do is I'll cross the road to where that man's just walking his dog there, because I think there's an opening up there where I could potentially capture that a little bit better. Let's see. Now we need to start making our way back towards the beginning. To do that, we have to follow a lengthy stretch of the A6068. There's not much to say about this, but its existence is good as far as the modern Higham resident is concerned. As the volume of traffic has increased over time, there was a serious problem in the centre of Higham before this bypass was built. Today, Barrowford Road solves that issue admirably by keeping traffic away from the historic village core. Higham is a village that's seen many changes, that's for sure. Over the last 40 years, more and more modern housing has been built on its outskirts. Many of the terraced properties have been renovated and modernised internally, and the old farm buildings have been renovated sympathetically and converted into homes. Higham is situated in the midst of the Pendle countryside, and although it's undergone many changes throughout its history, it still retains much of its rural charm. We're almost back to the start. As well as the weaving industry, one thing we haven't yet mentioned is the fact that Higham was also an important village for coal mining. Higham Colliery had a shaft from Habersham Colliery, which operated between 1912 and 1930. As well as that, Fir Tree's Drift Mine opened in 1953 with a workforce of 80. The last coal was mined in 1966. The only evidence of its existence is an electricity pole with a sign that reads Fir Tree's Drift SP. There was also an open cast mine within the parish too. That was the West Close Open Cast Mine, which operated between 1948 and 1959. That fact serves as a handy little introduction to West Close, which we've yet to discuss. As well as being associated with coal, it had a pretty big link to the Pendle Witches. Okay, on any normal good day, that view into the valley beyond from Moor Drive, where we've just been, would be fantastic, wouldn't it? But yeah, the weather's got other ideas today. It's starting to come across Higham now, so I'm actually starting to get a little bit wet. We are almost back to the car though, which means I can pretty much avoid the worst of the weather. Now, we've seen Higham, we haven't yet talked about West Close. Now, West Close, in broad terms, is the area between Higham and the river, which is in that valley. It's not an exact science because not everybody knows exactly where West Close lies. It's got a massive connection to the Pendle Witches, and for this bit I'm going to have to give you a load of pictures and I'll tell you exactly what happened in 1612. If you try to pinpoint West Close on the modern maps of the area, you probably won't find it. It's not that easy to determine. It's likely though that searches will direct you to West Close Farm. It's probably the closest you're going to get to it. In the days of the Pendle Witches, West Close was the home of the Chattox family, the second of the two main ones accused of witchcraft in the 1612 trials. The tragic story of the witches evolved in substantial part from dislike and feuding between the Chattox clan and the Demdike clan who lived at Newchurch. The precise site of the Chattox family dwelling at West Close is uncertain, and it certainly wasn't the present West Close Farm. According to diligent research by local historian John A. Clayton in his book The Pendle Witch Conspiracy, evidence suggests that the most likely candidate was the present-day Hayes Acre Farm on Foxendale Lane, where the ancient track of Higham Lane ran down to the River Calder. So, who were the Chattoxes? Well, the ringleader was Anne Whittle, who was also known as Old Chattox. In the Pendle Witch trials, her crimes were the supposed bewitching of Higham John Moore, causing the death of one of his sons. Anne Redfern was her daughter and another of the Chattox witches. Her clay figurines, made by hand, were apparently designed to cast spells on people. There were several others in the Chattox clan, but they were the main two. Anne Whittle had another daughter called Elizabeth, who was more commonly known as Bessie. So now we've learnt who the Pendle Witches were and where they lived across 3 separate episodes. What exactly happened then at the Pendle Witch trials in 1612? Let's find out. In 16th century rural England, witches were an accepted part of village life. Most were completely harmless. Many of those who became implicated in the trials considered themselves to be witches, but most were healers. They practiced magic, probably in return for payment. In early 1612, every Justice of the Peace in Lancashire was ordered by King James to compile a list of recusants in their area. These were people who refused to attend the English church and to take communion, a criminal offence at that time. We already know about one such person who flouted that law, Alice Nutter. Roger Nowell of Reed Hall on the edge of Pendle Forest was the Justice of the Peace for Pendle. It was against this background of seeking out religious nonconformists that in the March he investigated a complaint made to him by the family of John Law, a pedlar who claimed to have been injured by witchcraft. On her way to Trawden Forest, Alison Device, the granddaughter of Elizabeth Southerns, the head of the Demdike clan, encountered John Law and asked him for some pins. 17th century metal pins were handmade and relatively expensive, but they were frequently needed for magical purposes, such as in healing, particularly for treating warts. Alison was keen to get hold of them, but Law was reluctant to sell them to her. This infuriated Alison, and supposedly his refusal caused the devil to appear in the likeness of a black or brown dog with fiery eyes. A few minutes after the encounter, Law would stumble and fall and suffer a stroke. He managed to regain his feet and reach a nearby inn, though. Initially, Law made no accusations against Alison, but a few days later his son Abraham took Alison to visit him after the incident, where the witch reportedly confessed her wrongdoing. Alison Device, her mother Elizabeth and brother James were summoned to appear before Nowell on the 30th of March 1612. Alison confessed to selling her soul to the devil, and her brother stated that his sister had also confessed to bewitching a local child. The Demdikes were pretty much banged to rights by these confessions. The downfall of the Chattox witches was all down to Alison Device as well. There was almost certainly bad blood between the two families, possibly dating from 1601, when a member of the Chattox family broke into Malkin Tower, the home of the Devices, and stole goods worth about £1. It was the equivalent of £215 in today's money. When questioned by Nowell about Anne Whittle, Alison Device perhaps saw an opportunity for revenge and proceeded to accuse Chattox of murdering 4 men by witchcraft and of killing her father, John Device, who had died in 1601. Several further accusations were thrown around between the two families after that. Based on the evidence and confessions he'd obtained, Nowell committed 4 members of the Demdike and Chattox clans to Lancaster jail to be tried for maleficum, which is the act of causing harm by witchcraft. These were Elizabeth Southerns, Anne Whittle, Anne Redfern, and Alison Device. Perhaps that should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. On the 10th of April, which was a Good Friday, there was a meeting organised by Elizabeth Device at Malkin Tower, the home of the Demdikes. It was a sort of party, if you like, and to feed the guests, James Device had stolen a neighbour's sheep. When word of this gathering later reached Roger Nowell, he decided to investigate, and an inquiry was held before him and another magistrate, Nicholas Bannister, to determine the purpose of the meeting and what exactly had happened at it. As a result of that inquiry, 8 more people were accused of witchcraft and committed for trial. They were Elizabeth Device, James Device, Alice Nutter, Catherine Hewitt, John Bulcock, Jane Bulcock, Alice Gray, and Janet Preston. The meeting may not have had anything to do with witchcraft at all. As we learned in Roughly Booth, it may have been a secret Catholic meeting, and it's hard not to feel a little bit sorry for Alice Nutter if it was. Although they were illegal and attending it would have been a crime according to the law back then, had the witchcraft accusations not been flying around, Alice may have lived. The Pendle Witches, 12 in total, were tried in a group that included several others from across Lancashire. Some of the accused from Pendle, Alison Device included, seemed to have genuinely believed in their guilt, but others protested their innocence to the end. Here's what they were all tried for and convicted of. Janet Preston was the only one of the 12 who was not tried in Lancaster on account of her living over the border in North Yorkshire. Instead, her trial was held in York. Her charge was the murder, by witchcraft, of a local landowner, Thomas Lister of Westby Hall. According to a statement made to Nowell by James Device, Janet had attended the Malkin Tower meeting to seek help with Lister's murder. This damning evidence was enough to find her guilty, and her execution took place on the 29th of July on the Knavesmire, the present site of York Racecourse. In Lancaster, the remaining 11 were tried over 2 days, August the 18th and 19th. Anne Whittle was accused of the murder of Robert Nutter and pleaded not guilty when tried, but her confession to Roger Nowell was her downfall. It was read out in court, and evidence against her was presented by James Robinson, who had lived with the Chattox family 20 years earlier. Anne Redfern was initially charged with the murder of Robert Nutter. The evidence against her was considered unsatisfactory and was acquitted of that crime. However, there was a second charge, the murder of Robert Nutter's father, Christopher. Witnesses were called to testify that Anne was a witch more dangerous than her mother, and was eventually found guilty. Alison Device was charged with causing harm by witchcraft to John Law. Uniquely among the accused, Alison was the only one to be confronted in court by her alleged victim. When he was brought into court, Alison fell to her knees in tears and confessed, and therefore was found guilty. Elizabeth Device was charged with the murders of James Robinson, John Robinson, and together with Alice Nutter and Demdike, the murder of Henry Mitten. Elizabeth Device vehemently maintained her innocence. The main witness against her was her own daughter, Janet, who was about 9 years old. James Device also gave evidence against his mother, saying he'd seen her make a clay figure of one of her victims. Elizabeth was eventually found guilty. James Device himself was convicted. He pleaded not guilty to the murders by witchcraft of Anne Townley and John Duckworth. Because he'd earlier made a confession to Nowell, which was read out in court, that was sufficient to persuade the jury to find him guilty too. Jane Bulcock and her son John Bulcock, both from Newchurch, were accused and found guilty of the murder by witchcraft of Janet Dean. Both denied that they'd attended the meeting at Malkin Tower, but Janet Device identified Jane as having been one of those present, and John as having turned the spit roast to roast the stolen sheep. They had no answer to that, and were found guilty. Alice Nutter pleaded not guilty to the charge of murdering Henry Mitten by witchcraft. The only evidence against Alice seems to have been that James Device claimed Elizabeth Southerns had told him of the murder. Janet Device also said in her statement that Alice had been present at the Malkin Tower meeting. Rather unfortunately, I reckon, Alice Nutter was found guilty. Catherine Hewitt, alternatively known as Mould Heels, attended the meeting at Malkin Tower with Alice Gray. According to the evidence given by James Device, both Hewitt and Gray told the others at the meeting that they'd killed a child from Colne by the name of Anne Folds. Janet Device also picked Catherine out of a lineup and confirmed her attendance at the Malkin Tower meeting. Alice Gray was the only one of the accused to be found not guilty. Her charge was the same as that of Catherine Hewitt, the murder of Anne Folds. A detailed account of her trial doesn't exist though. Despite being identified as having been at the Malkin Tower meeting, somehow her fate was not the same as Alice Nutter's. Lastly, there was Elizabeth Southerns, but if the head of the Demdike clan was guilty, nobody ever got to find out. Whilst awaiting trial at Lancaster, the 80-year-old, a self-confessed witch for more than 50 years, died. The rest of the guilty witches were all hanged on the 20th of August 1612 at Gallows Hill. Folks, that's been one of the craziest runs I've ever done. This area is absolutely loaded with folktales, myths, legends and witchcraft. Its industrial heritage also can't be denied, and it's all wrapped up in an area of outstanding natural beauty. I cannot wait to come back to Pendle again and learn more about it. I've loved it here. See you later, Lancashire. It's been a pleasure. Now, just before I go, remember, this video is part of a huge project to visit every civil parish in England. That's more than 10,000. These routes are pre-planned, and due to time constraints, I can't cover every detail or walk down every street. Please don't complain if this video missed something out. I pronounce names how I choose to. I am very aware that local dialect may vary, and I don't take kindly to criticism about this. You've been warned. It's impossible to know everything too. If this video was terrible, make your own. If you're a regular watcher of The Village Idiot, you're not the only one. If you've got a small business, why not use my videos to advertise it? Leave a comment below if you're interested. And finally, thanks for watching this episode, everybody. Give us a like and a subscribe if you've enjoyed this episode, and share it with your friends and relatives. It all helps to keep this mission going. Until next time, I've been Andy, also known as The Village Idiot, and I'm out.